Well, we certainly were far ahead of JP Morgan, who was always following us. Remember, we started the Crash JP Morgan Buy Silver campaign, and what did they do? They got rid of all their shorts. They went super long silver. They're the largest holder of silver in the world because of us. Then we talked about Bitcoin. And now Jamie Dimon and JP Morgan introduced their own coin, right? First they dissed it, now they're joining it. We also talked about the US dollar as being, one for the history books, like all fiat currencies before it. And lo and behold, JP Morgan has issued a new report for their private wealth clients, so the people worth over $20 million, they get access to this report, and this is what they're telling their this is what they're telling their elite clients, while going on to the press in the U.S. and telling the ordinary person, "Oh, don't worry, everything's great." Well, is the U.S. dollar's exorbitant privilege coming to an end? This is J.P. Morgan saying this to their clients. The US dollar could lose its status as the world's dominant currency. How does this affect investors? First, they point out the role of China in this. And they point out that China's rising again back to where it was for thousands of years. This is a remarkable graph they use. This is China's share of global GDP going back to 1 AD. And as you see, it peaked in 1820 at 35%, and then it plunged because of the United Kingdom, in particularly the East India Company. Even there, if you look at the two opium wars, right, what it was the UK essentially was a narco state. East India Company provided a huge portion of the wealth of the United Kingdom. They dealt in opium. And they forced China to become an addict nation. They had warehouses full of this opium there. China tried to fight back and stop it. And what happened was that, the UK did have a greater Royal Navy, and they bombarded them. And then in the peace treaties, they took Hong Kong. And now that's back in the news. But this was the act of war. They plunged them into dark ages. And now JP Morgan says they're on the rise again.
That's right. China and India also were usually dominant economies throughout history. And then the American experiment was kind of an anomaly, which seems to be coming to an end. So if you look at that quarterly chart of use of dollars globally, it's constantly ebbing lower and lower. It's getting closer to dropping below 50%. So when it drops below 50%, and after World War II, I think it was as high as 75%, then you can say, yeah, the U.S. is no longer the dominant currency in the world today. Now, what that means for the U.S., just briefly, is that immediately prices for everything in the U.S. go up. Because if you lose the exorbitant privilege of having the world reserve currency, that means that you've actually got to pay real prices that everyone else are paying for stuff. And that means that inflation, which has been masked for 30 or 40 years by this exorbitant privilege, becomes real. And so standard of living would crash.
Then JP Morgan goes on again. Here's JP Morgan, the biggest bank in the United States, has benefited so much from the US taxpayer, from the Treasury, from the Fed, from the free money, from very special protections. They're made men, right? Well, as we scan client portfolios, they write, we see that many of them have far more US dollar exposure than we feel is prudent. At this stage of the economic cycle, we believe this exposure should be more diversified. In many cases, our recommendation would likely be to place a higher weighting on other G10 currencies in Asia, and gold. So I feel that their wealthy clients, if they want to retain their wealth, they should have some exposure to gold. And these are the very, very wealthy. I remember we've talked about this, that they have no exposure to gold. The exposure to gold is less than 1% at the moment. So gold, but I think you could also make the case for Bitcoin also being allocated in some of these family offices.
Right. Well, the Swiss franc shouldn't be on the list because they are mired in the central bank engaged in massive accounting shenanigans by buying lots of stocks. So they're exposed in a huge way. I would swap Swiss franc for Russian ruble. The ruble is, in fact, backed by gold at this point because they have very little debt and they have some of the biggest gold positions in the world to do that. And the second of all, you would diversify any gold position with Bitcoin. So I put 50% gold, 50% Bitcoin.
It's the same with gold. Is the very wealthy own, it's nation states and the very wealthy who own the most gold. And if they double their allocation to gold or triple it, as basically JP Morgan is suggesting that their very wealthy clients do, you could see a big move up over $2,000.
Oh yeah, gold goes from $1,500 to $4,500, $5,000, $6,000 an ounce, but Bitcoin goes from the current $1,300 an ounce or $10,000 an ounce to $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 an ounce and higher. So that's on a percentage basis, that's where you want to be. We're going to take a break. When we come back, much more coming your way.